Hi there. I'm really glad you chose to spend this quiet moment here tonight. Before we begin our journey, take a slow breath in and let it settle. And as you exhale, allow the noise of the present day to soften just a little. If you're listening from somewhere far away, perhaps it's late evening on the East Coast, just past sunset in the Midwest, or already deep into the night in California. I'd love for you to tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there right now, because there's something comforting about knowing that across different cities and time zones, we're all sharing this same calm space tonight. We're traveling back to 18th century England, but not to the glittering courts or grand country estates that usually dominate history books. Instead, we're stepping quietly into narrow village lanes lined with timber cottages, into fields marked by the slow rhythm of seasonal labor, into crowded London streets where ordinary men and women built lives that rarely appeared in portraits, yet quietly shaped the nation's future. This was a world without electricity, without factories roaring through the night, without the steady hum of engines. Time was measured in harvests and church bells, in daylight and candlelight, in the rising and falling cost of bread. As you settle in, imagine waking in a small cottage warmed by a dying hearth, hearing distant footsteps on packed earth outside, knowing that the day ahead will be shaped not by ambition or innovation, but by necessity. Tonight, we will move gently through that world, exploring how ordinary people worked, slept, worshipped, and endured, and how, without realizing it, they stood on the threshold of enormous change. Imagine for a moment that you are standing at the edge of an English field in the year 1700. The air is cool and slightly damp, and a pale mist still lingers low over the earth, clinging to the grass as if reluctant to release the night. There is no distant hum of machinery, no sharp echo of iron striking iron from a factory yard, no engine murmuring in the background of existence. What you hear instead is wind moving softly through hedgerows, the faint rustle of livestock shifting in their enclosures, and somewhere not too far away, the steady tolling of a church bell, marking the beginning of another ordinary day. This is England before the machines. The country is ruled by Queen Anne, who ascended the throne in 1702. But for most people living in cottages scattered across countryside parishes, the monarchy exists more as a distant abstraction than an active presence. Royal decrees may shape taxation, war, or trade, but daily life is governed far more directly by soil conditions, seasonal rhythms, and the expectations of the parish community. The nation itself contains perhaps 5 to 6 million people, the overwhelming majority of whom live not in cities, but in villages and small market towns surrounded by open fields that stretch outward in irregular strips divided by custom rather than fences. Time in this world does not move by the minute hand of a clock. It moves by harvests, by lambing season, by frost, by the slow return of daylight after winter's longest nights. Even in London, already the largest city in England and among the largest in Europe, the pace of life is not yet industrial. The River Thames carries ships heavy with imported goods, and streets can be crowded and noisy, but even there labor depends on muscle skill and daylight. When darkness falls, activity fades. Candles and hearth fires are precious and finite. If you were to walk into a village at dawn, you would see cottages constructed from timber stone or brick, depending on the region, their materials shaped as much by local geology as by tradition. In the wooded counties of the south and west, timber frames filled with wattle and daub still stood firm, their beams darkened by decades of smoke and weather. In parts of the Midlands, red brick, slowly becoming more common through the 17th century, gave some houses a sturdier squared appearance. In the north, and in areas where stone lay close to the surface, rough-hewn blocks formed thick walls that held back wind and cold with quiet determination. Roofs might be thatched with straw reeds, or heather layered carefully to shed rain, or tiled with clay where kilns operated nearby. Each roofline rose low against the horizon, practical rather than decorative, built to endure wind rather than impress the eye. The structures themselves were small, often consisting of a single main room downstairs, and perhaps a loft above reached by ladder or narrow stair. Windows were few and modest in size, sometimes glazed with small panes set in lead, sometimes still covered with oiled cloth that admitted light but not clarity. Floors might be packed, earth swept smooth, and sometimes strewn with rushes, or simple wooden boards worn thin by generations of feet. Within these walls, entire families slept, ate, worked, and waited out winter nights together. Beds were not separate chambers of privacy, but shared spaces, wooden frames strung with rope and topped with straw-filled mattresses, often accommodating parents and younger children side by side. Older children might sleep in the loft, wrapped in wool blankets against drafts that slipped through the roof. Privacy in such a world was rare and largely unknown as a concept. Conversations, arguments, laughter, and silence all unfolded within earshot of everyone present. Illness was tended publicly. Birth and death occurred in the same room where meals were prepared. Life did not divide itself into specialized spaces. It gathered itself inward. At the center of it all stood the hearth, built of stone or brick, blackened by soot and years of steady flame. It was more than a place to cook. It was the pulse of the house. A pot of pottage might hang suspended over embers, simmering slowly through the day, thickened with barley or oats, perhaps enriched with cabbage onions or a small piece of salted meat when fortune allowed. Bread was baked in communal ovens in some villages, but reheated and eaten beside the fire. Water was warmed there for washing. Wet wool stockings were stretched near its edge to dry. Tools were repaired in its light when daylight faded. In winter, the hearth defined survival. Without it, walls would offer little comfort against frost. Families gathered close, not only for warmth, but for reassurance. The glow of flame softened the darkness that pressed against small windows. Shadows moved across low ceilings, and in that flickering light, stories were told, some practical, some moral, some simply repeated, because repetition brought comfort. News carried from market towns was shared there. Parish announcements were discussed there. Prayers were murmured before sleep. Even the rhythm of the day revolved around the fire. It was stirred to life before dawn and banked carefully at night, its embers preserved beneath ash so that morning would not require beginning entirely from cold stone. In that small act of tending flame, one can sense the larger rhythm of domestic existence in 1700, continuity care, and the quiet persistence required to keep warmth alive from one day to the next. The structure of society is layered, but not in ways that feel fluid. At the top stand the landed gentry families who control estates whose wealth is measured in acres and rents collected. Below them are yeoman farmers who own and cultivate their own land, and beneath them, tenant farmers who lease fields from landlords. Then come agricultural laborers, men and women who work for wages tied directly to the seasons, whose employment may fluctuate with harvest success or failure. At the very bottom are the landless poor cottagers with little more than a garden plot and access to common land for grazing a cow or gathering fuel. And yet within this hierarchy, daily life is less theatrical than later histories sometimes suggest. Most individuals do not spend their days thinking about class in abstract terms. They think about bread, about maintaining tools, about whether the weather will hold. They think about keeping children fed and clothed through winter. Social mobility exists, but it is slow and uncertain. Stability more than ambition defines aspiration. Agriculture dominates everything. The open field system still present in many regions at the start of the century divides land into long strips cultivated collectively under shared customs. Fields lie unfenced, interwoven like fabric, and villagers cooperate according to established patterns that have evolved over generations. After harvest, common grazing allows animals to feed on stubble. Common rights permit the poor to gather firewood, glean leftover grain, or pasture a single cow. These rights are not luxuries. They are survival mechanisms embedded in tradition. When we think of England in 1700, it is tempting to imagine it as already moving toward industrial transformation. But that change has not yet arrived in visible force. There are no factory chimneys piercing the skyline, no railway lines cutting through farmland. The Industrial Revolution will emerge gradually later in the century, but in this moment, most labor is still performed by hand. Tools are simple wooden plows, iron scythes, spinning wheels, hand looms. Production is local. Exchange is often direct. Even London, though growing, remains bounded by physical limitations. Streets are narrow and irregular. Waste management is inconsistent. The city smells of animal smoke and river mud, yet it is also a place of opportunity, drawing migrants from rural counties who seek wages as servants, dock workers, artisans, or apprentices. The population of London at the turn of the century approaches 500,000, a staggering number for the era, but still a fraction of what it will become. Religion provides structure to this world. The parish church is not merely a place of worship, but a center of record-keeping and communal oversight. Baptisms, marriages, and burials are inscribed into parish registers, creating one of the most valuable historical sources we possess today. Attendance on Sundays is expected. The rhythm of the liturgical calendar shapes time alongside agricultural cycles. Festivals, fasts, and holy days punctuate the year. Life expectancy at birth hovers in the mid-30s, though this statistic hides a more complex reality. High infant mortality skews averages downward. Those who survive childhood may live into their 50s or beyond, but disease remains a constant presence. Smallpox, tuberculosis, and various fevers circulate with limited medical understanding. Remedies exist, but they are inconsistent and often based on tradition rather than scientific knowledge as we understand it today. Yet for all its hardship, this world is not defined solely by suffering. There is familiarity here, predictability, a sense that each day resembles the last in structure, if not in detail. The absence of rapid technological change means that skills pass from parent to child with continuity. A plow used by a father resembles the one used by his son. A cottage built by one generation shelters the next. If you listen carefully, you can almost sense the quiet stability beneath the surface. Not stability in wealth or security, but stability in rhythm. Morning light, midday labor, evening rest, the slow extinguishing of candles, the turning of seasons without interruption from machines that would later demand constant output. And somewhere beyond the fields, beyond the hedgerows and parish boundaries, forces are already beginning to gather: economic shifts, expanding trade networks, political tensions that will reshape this landscape within decades. But in 1700, those changes feel distant. The villagers do not wake with the knowledge that they stand on the edge of transformation. They wake to milk cows, to mend fences, to prepare pottage. This is a world still held together by custom rather than industry, by memory rather than innovation. It is quieter than the centuries that follow, slower, more vulnerable to weather, to harvest failure, to illness. Yet it is also deeply human in its scale. Lives are measured not by global markets, but by parish boundaries. News travels slowly. Letters are rare luxuries. If you let your thoughts drift through this landscape, you may begin to notice how differently time feels here. There is no urgency imposed by mechanical clocks or factory whistles. Daylight governs effort. Darkness invites rest. The body aligns with the environment rather than resisting it. And so as this first chapter settles around, you imagine standing once more in that early morning field. The mist is lifting now. Figures move in the distance, small, steady, unremarkable in history books, yet essential to the continuity of the nation. They do not know that historians will one day describe their era as pre-industrial. They do not know that machines will soon redefine labor, that enclosures will reshape fields, that cities will swell beyond imagination. They only know that today, like yesterday, requires work. And as the church bell fades into silence, the day begins. Z. If you remain in that village a little longer, allowing the morning light to rise fully above the hedgerows, you begin to understand something quiet but essential about England in 1700. It is a rural country, not symbolically rural, not nostalgically pastoral, but materially, overwhelmingly agricultural. Most people, perhaps 2/3 or more, live by the land. And the land, in turn, governs the shape of their days with a firmness that feels almost mythic in its authority. The fields do not stretch in neat, fenced rectangles as they often do today. Instead, in many regions, they are arranged in long, narrow strips, divided by memory and custom rather than hedges or walls. This is the open field system, an arrangement that has endured for centuries. A single large field is split into many strips, each assigned to different households within the village. No family holds its land in one solid block. Instead, they cultivate scattered strips woven among their neighbors, ensuring that good and poor soil are shared in rough fairness. From a distance, the fields resemble fabric-long bands of green and brown, stitched together across gently rolling ground. Oxen move slowly through them, pulling wooden plows tipped with iron. Men walk behind, steady and patient, guiding furrows into soil that has been turned in much the same way for generations. There is no roar of machinery here, only the measured rhythm of hooves pressing into earth and the soft tearing sound of soil yielding. Labor follows the seasons with unwavering precision. In early spring, fields are prepared and sown. Barley, oats, wheat, each grain placed into the ground, with an understanding that survival depends on the weather's mercy. Summer brings weeding, mending, watching the sky for signs of storm. Harvest arrives as both culmination and risk, demanding intense, coordinated effort. Entire villages gather to reap grain before rain can spoil it. Scythes sweep in wide arcs. Women and children bind sheaves. Sweat darkens linen shirts. Work continues from first light until dusk, because daylight is finite and the stakes are high. And yet, even in this labor, there is familiarity. Tools are known, movements are practiced. The body learns its role early in life and rarely forgets it. A child who begins by gleaning leftover stalks behind reapers grows into an adult who commands a team in the field. Knowledge is transmitted not through formal instruction, but through repetition, observation, and necessity. Beyond cultivated strips lie common lands, meadows, pastures, and wooded areas where villagers possess customary rights. These rights allow them to graze a cow, collect fallen branches for fuel, or gather berries in season. For the poorest households, such rights are not minor privileges, but critical elements of survival. A single cow sustained by common grazing can provide milk, butter, and sometimes a calf. Firewood gathered legally from common land keeps a hearth alive through winter. These customs are not written in neat legal language in most villagers' lives. They exist as inherited understanding, reinforced by communal expectation. The parish and manor courts occasionally formalize disputes, but daily practice relies on memory. Everyone knows, in a practical way, what is permitted and what is not. At the edge of this rural order stand the landlords and gentry, whose estates encompass large swaths of countryside. They do not always farm directly. Instead, they lease land to tenant farmers, who in turn manage laborers. The rent paid upward supports a hierarchy that is stable but rarely static. Harvest failures can strain relationships. Rents may be renegotiated or contested, yet even here, the system functions less as dramatic conflict and more as continuous negotiation. Wages for agricultural laborers fluctuate. In some regions at the start of the century, a man might earn 7 to 10 shillings per week during peak season, less during winter months when work diminishes. Payment may include meals, especially during harvest, but money remains tight. Bread prices matter deeply. When grain prices rise after poor harvests, anxiety spreads quickly through villages because food constitutes the largest portion of household expenditure. There are years when weather turns against expectation. A wet summer rots crops before they can be gathered. A harsh winter kills livestock. In such moments, rural life reveals its vulnerability. There is no large-scale agricultural insurance, no mechanized reserve. Survival depends on community support, parish poor relief, and careful stretching of resources. And slowly, so gradually that many do not immediately recognize its significance, a transformation begins to stir. Parliament passes enclosure acts throughout the century, formalizing the consolidation of scattered strips into consolidated holdings. Land that was once farmed collectively under customary rights becomes fenced and privately owned. Maps are drawn. Boundaries are marked with hedges and ditches. What was once open fabric becomes segmented. For some landowners, enclosure represents efficiency and profit. Larger, consolidated fields allow improved crop rotation methods and experimental agricultural techniques. Figures such as Jethro Tull advocate innovations like the seed drill, arguing for more systematic planting. Agricultural improvement becomes a concept, discussed in pamphlets and letters among the educated classes. But for smallholders and landless laborers, enclosure can mean loss in a way that is both practical and deeply unsettling. The disappearance of common rights does not arrive as a dramatic proclamation in daily life, but as a quiet narrowing of options. Where once a family might have relied on shared pasture to keep a single cow alive through the seasons, that access is gradually restricted, measured, or removed altogether. A cow can no longer graze freely across open strips after harvest. It must be supported on land that few among the poorest can afford. What had once been customary becomes conditional. Firewood, too, shifts from something gathered by right to something obtained with difficulty. Fallen branches that once could be collected from common woodland without question now require permission, payment, or are simply unavailable. The hearth still burns, but the effort to sustain it grows heavier. Each bundle of fuel carries a cost that is felt not only in coin, but in time and labor. Without those customary supports, households that once balanced precariously on a mixture of small cultivation, grazing rights, and seasonal work must recalculate their survival. Some families adapt by seeking more consistent wage labor on larger, consolidated farms, entering arrangements that tie them more directly to employers rather than to communal custom. Others find that remaining in the village offers diminishing possibility and begin to look outward. Market towns, with their modest trades and small industries, become destinations. For a few, the path extends further still toward growing cities, where employment may be uncertain, but opportunity appears broader than shrinking rural margins. These movements do not occur in sudden waves. They unfold gradually, almost imperceptibly at first. As individual decisions accumulate, a household leaves, another follows. Over time, such choices begin to shape patterns that will become more visible later in the century. But in the moment, they feel simply like necessary adjustments to a landscape that is no longer as open as it once was. Yet in the early decades of the 1700s, much of this remains partial. The countryside still holds its older patterns. Villagers still gather at seasonal fairs. Market days draw farmers and traders together, carts creaking along dirt roads, horses steady beneath loads of grain or wool. News travels slowly along these routes. Rumors of war abroad, changes in taxation, the occasional scandal from London. But such events rarely disrupt the immediate necessity of tending land. Religion continues to structure rural time as firmly as agriculture. Church bells mark Sunday worship. Parish meetings address local concerns. The churchyard fills gradually with generations whose lives unfolded within a few miles of where they now rest. Burial records, preserved carefully by parish clerks, testify to the steady rhythm of birth and death. Some families remain rooted in the same village for centuries, their names recurring in registers like quiet echoes. If you stand again at the edge of a field at dusk, after a long day's labor, you might notice how the landscape seems to gather sound into itself rather than release it. The wind moves through the grain heads with a low, steady whisper, bending them in gentle waves that catch the fading light. Footsteps soften against the earth. Voices, if there are any, carry only a short distance before dissolving into open space. Smoke rises thinly from cottage chimneys, drifting upward in narrow columns before spreading and thinning against the darkening sky, signaling that evening meals are being prepared within. The air carries the scent of soil and straw and wood smoke, familiar and unremarkable, repeated night after night. There is fatigue here, settled deep in muscles and joints, but it does not feel like crisis. It is the expected consequence of work completed, not a sign of something broken. The body leans into this exhaustion with a kind of quiet acceptance. It knows this pattern. It has followed it since childhood. Hands stiff from gripping tools will loosen by morning. Backs that ache at dusk will bend again at dawn. Weariness is not questioned. It is folded into the rhythm of living. The rural majority of England in 1700 does not imagine itself as standing at the threshold of industrial upheaval, because such a threshold is not visible from the field. There is no outline of factories on the horizon, no sound of engines gathering force, no railway lines cutting across cultivated strips. The future is not sensed as disruption, but as repetition. There is only the immediate continuity of plowing, sowing, and reaping, of watching clouds form and dissolve, of gauging the weight of grain in hand. Each season follows another with measured regularity. Each year is evaluated not by innovation, but by yield. The central question remains steady and practical. Will what has been gathered be enough to carry the household through winter once more? And yet, beneath that continuity, subtle tensions accumulate. Population begins to grow steadily across the century. More mouths require more grain. Land becomes more valuable. Efficiency becomes more urgent. Improvement becomes more persuasive. But tonight, as we linger in this early moment, the countryside still breathes in its older rhythm. Oxen lower their heads. Farmers rest hands on wooden handles polished smooth by use. Children carry small bundles of kindling homeward, along narrow paths worn into grass by countless feet. This is not a world of dramatic declarations. It is a world of gradual adjustment, of customs stretching until they strain, of land slowly redefined. If you allow your thoughts to settle here, in this wide, open landscape before fences rise higher and migration accelerates, you can sense both stability and fragility intertwined. The soil appears constant, but ownership shifts. The village seems eternal, but its structure is changing, and as the last light fades over the open fields, the rural majority returns indoors, unaware that the quiet alterations unfolding around them will, within a few generations, redraw the map of England itself. If you leave the open fields behind and step quietly through the low wooden door of a village cottage in the early 18th century, you cross not into privacy as we understand it today, but into concentration. Life here is gathered inward. The walls are close, the ceiling low, and every object within arm's reach carries purpose. The first thing you notice is warmth. If the fire has already been stirred to life, not a roaring blaze, but a steady glow held carefully within a stone or brick hearth darkened by years of smoke. The hearth is not decorative. It is structural to existence. Its blackened surface tells of countless meals prepared, countless evenings endured through winter cold. A pot may hang suspended from an iron hook, turning slowly above embers, the contents thickening through the day. The air smells faintly of ash and grain and damp wool drying nearby. Light enters the cottage in measured ways. Windows are small, sometimes fitted with leaded glass panes if the household can afford it, but often covered with oiled cloth that admits brightness without clarity. The daylight that filters through does not flood the room. It softens corners. It reveals texture. The rest of illumination comes from the fire and, after dusk, from candles or rushlights used sparingly, because tallow and wax carry cost. The floor beneath your feet might be packed earth, swept regularly and sometimes strewn with fresh rushes to absorb moisture and odor. In other cottages, especially in regions where timber is accessible, wooden boards line the ground, worn smooth by generations who have crossed the same narrow space daily. The boards creak quietly under weight, but not loudly. Sound in a cottage rarely travels far. It settles against walls and beams, becoming part of the interior hush. Furniture is minimal and deliberate. A heavy wooden table stands near the hearth, serving as preparation surface, eating place, and sometimes workbench. Benches or stools surround it, simple in construction. There may be one larger chair, reserved not as a throne, but as the most comfortable place in the house, often occupied by the eldest member of the family. Chests line the walls, containing clothing, linens, and the small number of possessions that define a household's material identity. Probate inventories from the period, recorded carefully after a death to assess property and debts, reveal how modest these belongings often are. A table, a few stools, one bedstead, pewter spoons, perhaps a single iron pot, a spinning wheel, a Bible if literacy has entered the family, each item listed with measured seriousness, because its value, though small, matters deeply. Beds themselves are communal structures, built less for comfort in the modern sense than for durability and shared necessity. A wooden frame, often simple and heavy, stands against the wall or near the warmest part of the room, its joints worn smooth by years of use. Thick cords are laced tightly across the frame, forming a woven base that must occasionally be tightened to prevent sagging. Upon this rests a mattress filled with straw or coarse flock, materials that shift and compress with time, requiring shaking and turning to maintain some measure of support. The surface is uneven, familiar to the body that has known no other. Blankets of wool are layered carefully, sometimes thin from long wear, sometimes patched where fabric has thinned. They hold warmth imperfectly, slowing the cold rather than excluding it entirely. In winter, breath may still be visible in the early hours before the hearth is revived, and feet seek warmth instinctively beneath shared covers. Sleep here is shaped by proximity. Parents and younger children lie side by side, bodies aligned not by preference, but by the practical need to conserve heat. The closeness is constant, not exceptional. Movement during the night is felt by all. Older children, when space allows, climb to a loft reached by ladder or narrow steps. The loft is not a separate room, but a raised extension of the main space, tucked beneath the sloping roof. There, drafts slip more freely through thatch or tile, and winter air presses closer. Separation exists in form, but not in full privacy. Sound travels upward easily. The glow of the hearth below casts faint light into the rafters before fading. Even in elevation, sleep remains part of the shared interior, shaped by the same rhythms of cold and warmth that define the room below. Privacy, in this world is not absent because it is forbidden. It is absent because space does not allow for its division. Illness is witnessed. Grief is shared in the same room where bread is sliced. Birth takes place near the hearth that has warmed countless evenings. The domestic sphere does not fragment experience into compartments. It holds all stages of life within reach of one another. Work continues indoors when fields lie dormant, not as an interruption to labor, but as its quieter extension. The rhythm shifts from wide movements across open ground to smaller, concentrated gestures contained within the walls of the cottage. Women sit near the hearth where light and warmth are strongest, their hands moving with practiced steadiness as they draw wool or flax into thread. The fibers pass through fingers that have repeated the motion thousands of times, twisting and tightening into a continuous line. The spinning wheel turns with a low, consistent hum, neither hurried nor slow, a sound that settles into the background of the room until it feels almost inseparable from breathing itself. Men remain occupied as well, though their tasks require different focus. Tools used in the field are examined and restored. Wooden handles are checked for splinters or weakness. Metal blades are drawn across whetstones in deliberate strokes, producing a faint scraping that marks the passage of time. Harness straps are inspected, stitched, or reinforced where wear has thinned the leather. These repairs are not occasional acts, but necessary preparations, ensuring that when the fields call again, nothing essential will fail. Children move between these activities, assisting where they are able. Small hands card wool into manageable bundles, separating fibers with repetitive care. Buckets are lifted and carried from the nearby well, water sloshing carefully but not wasted. Kindling is gathered and arranged beside the hearth, each small stick contributing to the preservation of warmth. Their contributions may be modest in scale, but they are woven into the same fabric of necessity that defines every adult task. Even indoors, even in stillness, the household remains in motion, each movement aligned with the quiet expectation that work, in one form or another, never truly pauses. Water must be brought in. There is no pipe to deliver it. A bucket carried from the village pump or stream stands near the hearth, used sparingly. Washing occurs in basins. Laundry, when undertaken, is a laborious task requiring heated water, soap, scrubbing, and drying space that winter rarely provides comfortably. Food preparation dominates the interior rhythm. Pottage simmers for hours, its ingredients modest but sustaining. Bread, baked elsewhere in communal ovens or at home if space permits, is sliced thickly. Cheese rests wrapped in cloth. Salted meat hangs from rafters if the household has been fortunate enough to preserve it. Meals are not elaborate, but they are structured around necessity and repetition. Sound in the cottage carries differently than in the open field. It does not disperse into distance. It gathers. The crackle of firewood punctuates silence. The scrape of wooden bowl against spoon becomes amplified. The murmur of conversation feels intimate, not because it is secret, but because walls are near enough to hold it. At night, once candles are extinguished to conserve supply, darkness settles fully. There is no external glow from distant towns, no artificial light beyond the last ember's faint pulse. The cottage becomes a contained island within a much larger landscape of shadow. Outside, wind may press against thatched roof or stone wall, but inside, warmth is held carefully at the center. Winter intensifies this interior life. Days shorten dramatically. The fire becomes constant companion. Fuel must be managed precisely. Wood stacks are finite, and coal, where used, must be purchased or transported. Clothing layers increase, movement slows. The cottage, already small, feels smaller still as family members remain indoors for longer hours. Yet there is continuity in this closeness. Repetition breeds familiarity. Children grow within walls that have contained previous generations. Stories told by firelight are not inventions of fantasy, but recollections harvest successes. Storms survived, relatives who once lived in the same space. Memory becomes part of the architecture. Even air carries evidence of persistence. Soot accumulates gradually along beams. Smoke stains darken upper walls. These marks are not considered damage in the modern sense. They are signs that the hearth has functioned as intended. To live here is to accept that surfaces will bear the imprint of survival. The cottage is not a retreat from labor, it is its extension. Wool spun indoors becomes cloth that protects against winter winds. Tools repaired by firelight return to field at dawn. Food prepared here sustains the body that must rise before sunrise. Every interior action anticipates exterior necessity. If you pause beside the hearth late in the evening, when others are drifting towards sleep, you might notice how the room seems to breathe slowly. Embers glow and fade, glow and fade. The sound of wind outside diminishes. The air grows still. Fatigue deepens into rest, not because the day has been easy, but because it has been completed. There is no illusion here that life will change dramatically tomorrow. The cottage does not suggest upward mobility or sudden fortune. It suggests continuity, endurance, a pattern that repeats with minor variations, but rarely with rupture. And yet, subtle pressures remain present even within these walls. Rising grain prices affect what fills the pot. Enclosure alters access to fuel. Population growth means more children sharing limited space. These shifts are not always visible in a single evening's glow, but they accumulate quietly. For now, however, as this chapter settles into night, the cottage stands firm. Its walls hold back wind, its hearth holds back cold. Its occupants sleep in shared warmth, unaware of the transformations gathering beyond their parish boundaries. The world outside may one day accelerate, divide, mechanize, and expand. But here, in 1700, life is contained within timber, stone, and flame. And as the last ember dims and the room falls into complete darkness, the cottage waits for morning, ready to begin again exactly where it ended. If you step outside the cottage and follow the narrow road that winds toward the nearest market town, you begin to sense another force shaping life in 18th century England, one quieter than war, less visible than law, yet felt daily in every household. That force is food, not as cuisine or abundance, but as calculation, as weight, as price. In this world, grain stands at the center of survival. Wheat, barley, oats. These are not background crops, but the foundation of daily existence. Bread is not merely one item among many. It is the measure against which all other nourishment is judged. A household may supplement its diet with cabbage from a small garden plot, with onions stored from autumn, with cheese if a cow has yielded milk, or with a small portion of salted pork when fortune allows. But bread anchors the meal. Without it, the table feels incomplete in a way that cannot easily be substituted. Morning often begins with bread left from the previous day, sometimes softened in broth or ale to make it easier to eat. Midday may bring a thicker pottage grain simmered with whatever vegetables are available, perhaps enriched by scraps of meat. Evening returns again to bread, its texture, its density, its color. These vary depending on the grain used and the wealth of the household. White wheat bread, lighter and finer, is more expensive and more closely associated with those of means. Darker bread made from mixed grains or barley fills the stomach reliably but lacks refinement. Yet hunger does not discriminate based on refinement. The price of grain fluctuates with alarming sensitivity to weather. A single season of heavy rain can dampen yield. A cold spring may stunt growth. When harvests are good, grain moves steadily from field to mill to market. When they are poor, scarcity begins quietly but spreads quickly. Market days become tense. Farmers and traders gather in town squares with sacks of grain loaded onto carts. Buyers approach carefully, aware that a rise in price today may signal hardship tomorrow. Market records and assize documents from the period reveal how closely communities watch the cost of bread. There exists a concept deeply embedded in local expectation, the just price. Though not written formally into law in the way modern regulations are, the idea persists that food should not be sold at exploitative rates during times of shortage. When prices rise too sharply, suspicion grows. Is the shortage genuine, or is grain being withheld to drive profit higher? Such suspicion occasionally erupts into collective action. Food riots, when they occur, are rarely chaotic in the way later centuries might imagine. They often follow a pattern. Groups frequently, including women, confront merchants, insisting that grain be sold at what they deem a fair rate. In some instances, sacks are seized, sold at lower prices, and the money returned to the merchant at that reduced rate. These actions are not framed as rebellion against authority, but as defense of community balance. The aim is not revolution, but correction. Yet beneath these confrontations lies something deeper and more constant than the visible tension of a crowded market square. The fragility of subsistence itself for a laboring family. Income does not arrive as a steady, predictable flow. It is finite, often tied to the agricultural calendar, rising during harvest and thinning during winter months when work is scarce. Coins earned through long hours in the field or on day labor are counted carefully, already assigned in the mind before they are even spent. Bread consumes the largest portion of that expenditure. It is not a luxury, but the foundation of the household diet, and therefore the first and most immovable demand on limited wages. When its cost rises, even slightly, the change ripples outward through every other calculation. There is little margin elsewhere to absorb the increase. Meat, if present at all, may already appear only occasionally. Portions may already be modest. There is no hidden reserve of abundance waiting to be drawn upon. Clothing, too, cannot be postponed indefinitely. Linen and wool wear thin with use. Shoes crack in damp conditions. Repairs can extend their life for a time, but not forever. Fabric and leather must eventually be replaced, and replacement requires coin. Rent remains due regardless of harvest outcome or bread price. Landlords do not reduce demands simply because the market has shifted. Thus, the rise of grain prices is not received as a distant economic fluctuation or an abstract signal of supply and demand. It is felt immediately and physically. It compresses options. It forces adjustments that are not theoretical but lived. Portions are measured more carefully. Purchases are reconsidered. Small comforts are set aside. The corridor through which a family moves each week becomes narrower, its walls pressing closer, until survival depends on how carefully each step is placed. In years of scarcity, the atmosphere in villages and towns shifts perceptibly. Conversations linger on yield, on rumors from neighboring counties, on reports of ships delayed or crops damaged. The body becomes more aware of portion size. Meals thin slightly. Pottage stretches further with added water. Hunger does not always appear as dramatic famine. More often, it manifests as persistent insufficiency. The winter of 1740-41, for example, brought severe weather conditions across parts of Britain and Europe, affecting harvests and raising grain prices sharply. While not uniformly catastrophic in every region, such years remind communities of their vulnerability. Parish poor relief records show increased distribution of aid during difficult seasons. The parish becomes not only a spiritual center, but an economic buffer, providing minimal support to those unable to sustain themselves. Markets, therefore, become spaces of tension layered over routine. Stalls display loaves stacked carefully. Scales weigh grain with deliberate precision. Buyers count coins slowly, aware that each purchase must stretch. The miller, grinding grain into flour, stands at a critical point in the chain, sometimes accused of taking excessive tolls, sometimes defended as necessary intermediary. Transportation limits also shape availability. Roads are often uneven, subject to mud and seasonal damage. Grain grown in one county does not always move easily to another. Thus, regional variation in price can persist, intensifying local anxiety. News of cheaper grain elsewhere may travel by rumor, but cannot always be realized in practice. At the household level, food storage becomes a quiet form of planning, almost a discipline in itself. After harvest, grain must be preserved with steady attention, kept dry and protected from damp air that seeps into poorly sealed spaces. Moisture is patient and persistent. It finds small openings and settles unnoticed until spoilage reveals itself too late. Vermin, too, are constant adversaries, drawn by scent and warmth. Sacks must be lifted from the ground, containers checked, lids secured. What has been gathered with effort must be guarded with equal care. Flour, once ground, is even more vulnerable. Exposed to moisture, it clumps, molds, and loses its usefulness. Its fine texture, so necessary for bread, can be undone by neglect. Salted meat must remain dry as well, hung where air circulates, but damp does not gather. If it spoils, the loss is not merely culinary, but practical, removing one of the few concentrated sources of nourishment available. Root vegetables, turnips, carrots. Onions are stored in cellars or shallow pits lined to reduce frost's intrusion. They are layered carefully, insulated against winter's reach. Each stored item represents continuity, a bridge from harvest to spring. In such a household, security is rarely measured by coin alone. Money may pass through hands quickly, but grain stacked safely, flour kept dry, and vegetables protected from rot offer reassurance that is tangible. The sense of stability rests on what can be seen and touched, counted in sacks rather than in abstract sums. There is also a social dimension to hunger that extends beyond individual walls. Those who struggle visibly may turn to neighbors, not through formal declarations, but through quiet exchanges, shared loaves, borrowed measures of grain, invitations to join a meal when possible. Informal charity moves through communities in understated ways. Shame can accompany need, as reliance on others exposes vulnerability. Yet the shared awareness that misfortune may come to any household tempers judgment. Illness, a failed harvest, or a lost wage can alter circumstances swiftly. In that understanding, assistance is offered not as spectacle, but as acknowledgement that survival in such a world is rarely secured alone. Commonly consumed, functions partly as nourishment, brewed from grain. It provides calories and hydration in a form often safer than untreated water. Its production is domestic in many households, though commercial brewing expands in towns. Even this staple, however, depends on grain availability. Scarcity reverberates outward. If you pause in a market square at midday, listening as transactions unfold, you may detect the low hum of negotiation, layered with calculation, the weight of a loaf, the fairness of a measure, the trustworthiness of a seller. No grand speeches occur, no dramatic proclamations, only small exchanges that collectively determine whether households eat adequately that week. The body, in this world, becomes sensitive to fluctuation. Appetite sharpens when food thins, energy wanes when portions shrink. Children feel hunger first in restlessness. Adults mask it with patience, yet the cycle continues. Because even scarcity does not suspend routine entirely. Fields must still be tended. Tools must still be repaired. It is important to remember that England in 1700 is not uniformly starving. Many years pass without crisis. Many households manage within narrow margins successfully. But the ever-present possibility of shortage shapes behavior. It encourages thrift. It discourages waste. It fosters watchfulness. By late evening, when the market empties and villagers return home, sacks lighter or heavier depending on fortune, the cottage once again becomes the center of food's transformation. Grain purchased becomes flour. Flour becomes bread. Bread becomes sustenance measured slice by slice, and as night settles, with pottage simmering quietly and loaves resting on wooden boards, there is no certainty beyond the immediate horizon. Will next year's harvest be kind? Will prices remain steady? No one knows. They only know that tomorrow requires strength, and strength requires food. Thus, food in the 18th century England is never merely nourishment. It is stability. It is anxiety. It is community tension contained within daily ritual. It is the quiet arithmetic of survival. And as the fire dims and bowls are cleared, the body rests not in abundance, but in adequacy, hoping that the balance will hold just a little longer. If one were to reconstruct 18th century England solely from official documents, the impression would be uneven. Names that recur in contracts, leases, and court records are overwhelmingly male. Land is transferred between fathers and sons. Apprenticeship agreements bear signatures of masters. Tax lists enumerate household heads. Authority, in written form, appears structured around men. Yet inside nearly every ordinary household, the continuity of daily life rests upon labor that leaves far fewer formal traces, work so constant that it rarely pauses long enough to be documented in the language of contracts or property. It does not appear in columns of figures or in the carefully inked signatures that survive in parish archives. It does not attach itself to titles, inheritances, or official authority. There are no seals pressed into wax to certify its completion, no witnesses summoned to confirm its value. It operates outside the narrow frame through which public life is usually recorded. It does not announce itself through legal standing or civic recognition. It does not rise to the level of parliamentary concern or enter the debates that shape taxation and land. Instead, it exists beneath those visible structures, sustaining them without demanding acknowledgement. Its presence is felt not in proclamation, but in repetition. Fires are lit, meals are prepared, clothing is maintained, children are tended. These acts do not gather into spectacle. They accumulate quietly, within the walls of cottages and townhouses alike. This labor unfolds with steadiness rather than interruption. It is measured not by dramatic milestones, but by daily renewal. Each completed task folds into the next, creating a chain of continuity that allows the household to function without visible strain. In this way, it shapes the lived experience of the century, not by drawing attention to itself, but by making stability possible. It becomes foundational precisely because it is constant, more structural than noticeable, more sustaining than celebrated. The domestic day does not begin with ceremony. It begins with attention. Before daylight fully enters the room, someone has already tested the embers beneath ash, determining whether the fire can be revived without starting anew. A flame must be coaxed carefully, because without it there is no warm water, no softened bread, no stable center to the room. This small act, repeated every morning, establishes the tone for what follows. Nothing dramatic has occurred, yet the household has already shifted from night into function. The labor that continues through the day is not arranged in isolated tasks, but layered into one another. Wool waits to be carded. It must be drawn apart. Fibers aligned by hand so that they can be spun evenly. This is slow work, repetitive and exacting, and it requires concentration that cannot be rushed without weakening the result. Once prepared, the fiber is fed toward the spinning wheel. The wheel turns not with urgency, but with steady discipline. And thread begins to form between fingers, trained by repetition rather than instruction. The tension must be felt. Too much and it snaps. Too little and it frays. There is no mechanical gauge. There is only the body's learned precision. This thread will not remain abstract, suspended merely as a thin line between fingers and spindle. It carries a future already embedded within it. It will be gathered, wound, and eventually woven into cloth. And that cloth will be cut and stitched into garments shaped to the body. Those garments will stand between skin and damp wind, slowing the chill that settles into bone during early mornings in the field. They will absorb sweat during harvest, darkening with effort, drying again by the fire before the next day begins. They will endure repeated wear, stretching, thinning, being mended, and worn again. Their strength tested by labor that does not pause for delicacy. In this way, the agricultural cycle depends invisibly on this interior labor. The visible work of plowing and reaping relies on protection fashioned indoors. The endurance of the body in open fields rests partly on what has been prepared within enclosed walls. Though the fields may dominate the landscape, wide and exposed beneath the sky, they are supported by what occurs beside the hearth. The quiet turning of the wheel, the steady formation of thread, the transformation of fiber into fabric. These movements do not announce themselves in the open air, yet they form the unseen framework that allows labor beyond the cottage to continue without interruption. Meanwhile, laundry introduces a different form of exertion. Water must be drawn from well or pump, carried in weighty buckets back to the house, heated over flame, and mixed with soap often made from ash and animal fat. Or linen must be scrubbed by hand against rough surfaces until dirt loosens. Wool requires more careful handling to prevent shrinkage. Steam thickens the air. Arms tire. Fingers redden when finished. Garments must be wrung and hung where air can circulate. Though winter complicates drying and increases the risk of mildew, the process is not occasional, it recurs regularly, because clothing worn in fields or streets cannot be left unattended. Food preparation threads continuously through these motions. Grain must be measured with foresight. Flour must be kneaded into dough, whose consistency is judged by feel rather than formula. Pottage simmers slowly, extended when supplies thin, enriched modestly when fortune allows. Salted meat is inspected to ensure dryness. Root vegetables are sorted to prevent rot from spreading. Milk, once drawn, cannot be neglected. It must be churned into butter or set into cheese before spoilage begins. The timing is precise but unwritten, held in memory across generations. In rural households, small garden plots supplement the main harvest, extending the reach of larger fields into the narrow spaces beside the cottage. These plots are rarely expansive, yet they are cultivated with careful attention, their boundaries marked more by habit than by fence. Cabbage grows in steady rows, its leaves thick and layered. Onions push upward from the soil, their presence modest but dependable. Herbs cluster in corners where light and moisture allow them to thrive. These modest crops do not replace the central importance of grain, but they soften its dominance, adding texture to meals that might otherwise feel repetitive. Their value lies not in abundance, but in steadiness. When market prices rise unexpectedly, when grain becomes dearer than anticipated, the presence of vegetables grown close to home offers a measure of resilience. They reduce reliance on purchase, even if only slightly. They stretch pottage further, add flavor where monotony might otherwise prevail, and remind the household that not all nourishment must pass through the uncertainty of the market square. Poultry, too, fits into this quiet economy. Chickens are tended with routine care, fed from scraps, sheltered at night. Eggs are collected regularly, small and unremarkable in appearance, yet significant in their contribution. Each small yield, each head of cabbage, each gathered onion, each egg enters the household ledger, not as luxury, but as reinforcement. Together, they help maintain a fragile balance between sufficiency and shortage, tipping the scale just enough to steady it when larger forces threaten to unsettle it. For many young women, domestic labor extends beyond their natal homes into service within other households. Domestic service becomes one of the most common forms of female employment during the century. A young woman may leave her village to enter a merchant's or artisan's home, where she rises before her employers, prepares fires, assists in cooking, cleans rooms, washes linens, and retires after the household has settled. Her compensation is modest, often combined with room and board, and her position depends heavily on reputation. A dismissal, whether justified or not, may limit future prospects, yet service also provides exposure to literacy, to urban life, to broader social networks, and for some, it precedes marriage or transition into other forms of work. Marriage alters the configuration of labor, but does not diminish it. In farming families, wives contribute directly to agricultural routines through dairy management, garden cultivation, preparation of meals for hired hands during harvest, and oversight of domestic order. In artisan households, wives often assist in trade, whether by helping produce goods, serving customers, or maintaining informal accounts. The distinction between domestic and economic spheres remains porous. Survival requires both. Childbearing shapes women's lives profoundly in this period. Pregnancies are frequent. Birth takes place at home, attended by midwives whose authority rests on accumulated experience rather than institutional training. The same room that shelters spinning and cooking becomes the site of delivery. Outcomes vary. Parish burial registers testify to the reality of infant mortality and maternal death. While less common, remains a known risk. When survival follows, recovery is brief. Household needs do not suspend themselves for long. The spinning wheel waits. The hearth must be tended. Water must be drawn. Children grow within this environment of constant motion. Daughters learn by observation and participation, absorbing skills without formal instruction. Sons witness the same persistence. The domestic sphere does not announce lessons. It embodies them. Tasks expand gradually with age, scaled to strength and understanding. Religion intersects with these routines quietly but persistently. Parish attendance structures the weak. Moral expectations emphasize diligence, modesty, and obedience. Later in the century, Methodist gatherings will open new spaces for female religious expression. But at the beginning of the century, parish life dominates. Faith provides language for endurance and frameworks for conduct, even as it reinforces social expectations. What becomes clear when observing this world closely is that women's labor does not exist as a series of discrete acts, but as an integrated system. Garments spun and mended enable field labor. Meals prepared before dawn sustain men who appear more prominently in wage records. Children raised and instructed informally become the next generation of workers. Market exchange depends upon preserved food and maintained clothing. The visible economy rests upon invisible continuity, yet this labor seldom generates public acknowledgement. Probate inventories may list a spinning wheel or a chest of linen, but they cannot record the hours embedded within those objects. Legal documents may name a household head, but they rarely itemize the daily exertion that keeps that household intact. The absence of formal recognition does not diminish the scale of the work. It simply renders it structurally assumed. As evening approaches, labor does not end abruptly, it thins gradually. The spinning wheel slows as light fades. Dough is covered, milk is set aside. Tools are leaned carefully against walls, positioned for tomorrow. Blankets are arranged. Embers are banked beneath ash, so that morning will not require beginning entirely from cold stone. Exhaustion settles into the body, not as collapse, but as integration, the natural result of sustained motion. Outside, England continues its gradual transformation through population growth, agricultural change, and expanding trade. But within these walls, the rhythm remains astonishingly consistent. Tomorrow the fire will be coaxed again, thread will form again between steady fingers, water will be carried again, meals will be prepared again. And this repetition, so easily overlooked in grand historical narratives, will quietly uphold the structure of the century. Nothing here is fragmented, nothing theatrical. It is a continuous current of labor flowing through days, seasons, and years, binding together households that in turn bind together villages and towns. When sleep finally overtakes the room, it does so in a space held securely by that current, not paused, but merely waiting to resume with the first light of morning. Childhood in 18th century England does not unfold as a protected interval separated from the demands of adult life. It exists within the same rooms, under the same roof, and under the same expectations that shape everyone else. There is affection, certainly there is care, but there is no prolonged suspension of responsibility. From an early age, children are drawn gradually into the rhythm of work, not because discipline requires it, but because survival does. In rural households, a child's first tasks are small and observational, carrying kindling, watching livestock, gathering scattered sheaves left behind in harvested fields. These acts are not framed as training. They are simply participation. A young child stands beside an older sibling or parent and absorbs the pattern of movement through repetition. By the time adolescence approaches, the motions feel natural rather than assigned. Clothing reflects this integration into labor. There is no elaborate distinction between play garments and work garments. Fabric must endure. Shoes, when available, are worn carefully. Growth is rapid, and garments are adjusted, mended, and handed down. Childhood, in this sense, does not appear visually separate from adulthood. It moves toward it almost seamlessly. Mortality shadows early years. Parish registers across England record the frequent burial of infants and young children, illness fevers, infections. Smallpox circulates without the benefit of modern medical intervention. Survival past the most vulnerable years offers cautious relief, but not certainty. The fragility of life shapes parental attachment in ways that are steady rather than sentimental. Care is constant, but grief is also familiar. Education exists, though unevenly. In some parishes, basic instruction in reading may be available, often tied to religious instruction. Charity schools begin to appear more frequently in towns during the early 18th century, supported by religious societies that aim to provide literacy and moral guidance to poor children. Attendance is not universal. Agricultural labor schedules may limit participation. Yet even limited schooling introduces the ability to read scripture, to sign one's name, to engage with written word in modest ways. Literacy, however, is not the central pathway into adulthood for most children, nor is it the primary measure by which readiness is judged. The ability to read scripture or sign one's name may carry value, especially within parish life, but it does not by itself secure livelihood. Skill, by contrast, holds immediate weight. It can be seen, tested, corrected. It determines whether a tool is handled properly, whether material is shaped accurately, whether work can be trusted. In a world structured around production and service, competence in a trade forms the bridge between dependence and self-sufficiency. By the early teenage years, sometimes younger formal apprenticeship becomes a defining transition, marking a shift, not through ceremony but through contract. An apprenticeship indenture, often recorded in parish or guild documents, binds a child to a master for a fixed term of years, commonly 7. The document itself is precise in its language, setting out obligations on both sides. The master promises instruction in the craft, as well as food and lodging within the household, and in some cases clothing sufficient for the term. The apprentice, in turn, pledges obedience, labor, and commitment, agreeing to serve faithfully and to refrain from conduct deemed improper or disruptive. Parents, when present and able, may negotiate the terms, seeking a master known for stability or skill. In cases of poverty or orphanhood, parish officials may intervene, arranging placements intended to secure the child's future and relieve the parish of long-term support. Once agreed, the indenture formalizes the transition. Childhood narrows into structured service. Learning becomes inseparable from labor, and the path toward adulthood is set not by abstract instruction, but by sustained practice under supervision. For rural families with limited land, apprenticeship offers structured entry into skilled trades. A boy might be apprenticed to a blacksmith, a carpenter, a tailor. In towns, trades multiply: shoemakers, printers, bakers, coopers. Each craft requires patience and repetition. The apprentice begins with menial tasks: sweeping floors, fetching tools, observing processes. Gradually, technique is introduced: measurement, alignment, timing. The hand learns under supervision. The apprenticeship contract is not simply educational, it is social relocation in its fullest sense. The child does not merely attend instruction during certain hours and return home afterward. Instead, he leaves the familiar structure of his own household and enters another entirely, crossing not just physical distance but social boundaries. The master's home becomes his primary environment, and with that shift comes integration into a new rhythm of life. He eats at the master's table, sleeps under the same roof, and participates in routines that extend beyond the workshop itself. Work and domestic life are not separated. They are interwoven. Meals are shared within this arrangement, reinforcing both dependence and belonging. The apprentice is neither guest nor equal, but neither entirely external. Discipline is enforced internally, as part of household order rather than external regulation. The master's authority extends beyond technical instruction. He governs conduct, punctuality, demeanor, and obedience. Craft is learned alongside behavior. Expectations about diligence and restraint are communicated not only through formal correction, but through daily example and oversight. Parish authorities may intervene in disputes when necessary, especially if terms of the indenture are violated. Yet such intervention remains secondary. The everyday texture of apprenticeship unfolds under the master's supervision, shaped by proximity and hierarchy. For girls, apprenticeship exists as well, though often in forms that reflect prevailing domestic expectations. Domestic service functions as a parallel pathway, structured differently but no less binding. A young girl may enter a household not simply as temporary help, but as a learner embedded within its routines. She learns cooking through repetition, cleaning through practice, childcare through observation and assistance. Household management, timing, organization, attention to detail becomes part of her instruction. In some urban settings, girls are apprenticed formally to seamstresses or milliners, where needlework and garment construction form the core of training. The skill acquisition differs in kind from that of many boys' trades, yet it remains structured and contractual, grounded in obligation, supervision, and gradual competence within another household's walls. Urban poverty introduces another dimension to childhood. In London, institutions such as the Foundling Hospital emerged to care for abandoned infants. Founded in 1739, it reflects the scale of social strain in a growing city. Children admitted there are raised within institutional discipline, some later apprenticed into trades. The existence of such an institution underscores both compassion and vulnerability within the 18th century society. Workhouse systems also intersect with childhood. Under the poor laws, parishes hold responsibility for those unable to support themselves. Orphaned or destitute children may be placed into apprenticeships arranged by parish officials, sometimes at younger ages than wealthier families would choose. These placements aim to reduce long-term dependency on parish relief by integrating children early into productive roles. The emotional dimension of separation must not be overstated, but neither should it be dismissed. When a child leaves home for apprenticeship, the departure is practical rather than ceremonious. There are no elaborate farewell rituals. The movement is expected, necessary. Yet it alters the household's internal balance. Fewer hands remain at the hearth. One less voice joins evening conversation. In both rural and urban settings, discipline forms part of upbringing. Correction is physical at times, reflecting broader social norms. Obedience is valued. Idleness is discouraged, not as moral abstraction, but as economic risk. A child who cannot perform tasks or learn a trade threatens future stability. Recreation exists, though in forms integrated into environment. Seasonal fairs, local festivals, church gatherings provide intervals of collective relief. Informal games unfold in fields or lanes, but extended leisure, detached from responsibility, remains rare. Time is structured around utility. It is important not to flatten childhood into hardship alone. Within households, bonds form through proximity. Stories are told, skills are shared, laughter exists alongside labor. The absence of modern educational systems does not equate to absence of learning. It merely reorients it toward observation and repetition rather than abstraction. By the time adolescence concludes, the transition into adult expectation is gradual rather than sudden. A young apprentice nearing the end of term anticipates becoming a journeyman, capable of earning independent wages. A servant who has completed years within a household may consider marriage. The boundary between youth and adulthood blurs, defined more by capability than age. England in 1700 does not conceive of childhood as a prolonged developmental stage requiring protection from the adult world. Instead, it assumes that integration into that world must begin early and proceed steadily. The rhythm of fields and hearth leaves little room for postponement. If one pauses to observe a village lane at midday, one might see a boy carrying tools too large for his frame, walking behind a master toward a workshop, a girl balancing a basket of laundry, adjusting its weight carefully as she moves. Neither appears tragic, neither appears exceptional. They are simply in motion, absorbing the structure of their society. Parish records will later show their names in marriage entries, in burial registers, in property transfers. The early years, however, remain largely unrecorded, except through apprenticeship documents and occasional charity records. Childhood, like women's labor, is often visible only in fragments, yet it shapes everything that follows in ways that are not immediately visible but gradually become decisive. The skills learned in youth do not remain confined to childhood. They settle into the body and mind, guiding the choices and limits of adult life. The ability to handle tools with confidence, to measure grain accurately, to maintain rhythm at a spinning wheel, to obey instructions without hesitation. These early acquisitions quietly influence economic position. Opportunity is rarely abstract. It grows from competence. The discipline absorbed through repetition defines conduct long before it is articulated as virtue. The early assumption of responsibility molds expectation, teaching not only what must be done, but what one can endure. The century's labor force, its artisans shaping wood and iron, its domestic servants managing other households, its farmers guiding plows across long strips of land all begin here. Within households where childhood merges gradually into contribution, there is no sharp divide between learning and doing. The boundary dissolves through use. As evening approaches and children return from tasks, whether from field, workshop, or employer's kitchen, the household gathers again around the hearth. And instruction continues without announcement. A tool is examined for wear, and in the examination a lesson is embedded. A mistake is corrected, not as humiliation but as adjustment. A story is told that carries within it a warning or an example of patience. Knowledge circulates through conversation and demonstration rather than formal declaration. There is no proclamation that youth has ended. There is no ceremony marking maturity. The transition occurs through accumulation. Movements become steady. Judgment improves. Tasks that once required supervision are performed without reminder. One day, without fanfare, the work no longer feels borrowed. It feels owned. And so, within 18th century England, childhood does not stand apart from the broader economy as a protected interval. It feeds into it quietly and steadily, shaping individuals who will carry forward the same rhythms they absorbed from their earliest days. The wheel turns, the field waits, the market opens, and somewhere in the midst of it all, a child learns not through abstraction or theory, but through participation, absorbing the structure of the world by inhabiting it. If the countryside moves according to soil and season, London moves according to pressure. By the early 18th century, London is already the largest city in England and one of the largest in Europe, its population approaching 500,000 and continuing to grow. It does not expand in clean geometric lines. It swells. Streets press outward beyond medieval boundaries. Lanes narrow as buildings rise. The Thames carries ships thick with good sugar, tobacco, tea, while the docks fill with laborers who depend on the river's rhythm, as completely as farmers depend on rainfall. To arrive in London from a rural parish is to encounter density. Sound does not disperse here the way it does across open fields. It accumulates. Cartwheels grind against cobblestones. Vendors call out wares. Apprentices run messages between shops. Bells ring from multiple parishes within earshot of one another. The air holds coal smoke, river damp, and the mingled presence of thousands of bodies sharing limited space. Work in London multiplies into forms not visible in most villages. Dock workers unload cargo from ships anchored along the Thames, their labor dictated by tides and merchant schedules. Porters carry goods across uneven streets. Artisans cluster in districts associated with specific trade: shoemakers, printers, tailors, cabinet makers, each workshop contributing to a network of urban production. Domestic servants fill townhouses belonging to merchants and professionals. Street vendors sell bread, fish, fruit, ribbons, small necessities that pass quickly from hand to hand. The city's economy depends not only on skilled trades, but on precarious employment. Casual labor is common. A man may find work unloading one shipment and none the next week. Wages fluctuate. Rent, however, remains constant. Housing compresses bodies into narrow interiors, often subdivided into multiple families sharing limited space. Privacy, already rare in rural cottages, becomes even more fragile here. Markets expand not only in physical size, but in complexity and specialization. Covent Garden hums with produce and small goods. Billingsgate concentrates the flow of fish brought upriver. Smithfield anchors the trade in livestock. Each site develops its own rhythms, its own regular buyers and sellers, its own expectations about price and quality. Exchange becomes layered, structured, and increasingly visible. Food moves toward the city in greater volume than in previous generations, drawn from surrounding counties and transported along roads and river routes that grow busier with each passing year. Yet this increase in movement does not eliminate vulnerability. When supply falters, whether from poor harvests, transport delays, or price manipulation, the consequences ripple quickly through urban neighborhoods. Urban residents experience fluctuations in grain price with a sharpness equal to that felt in rural parishes. The difference lies in proximity. In the countryside, scarcity can sometimes be observed directly in the fields. In the city, it arrives through the market stall and the baker's counter. Dependence becomes mediated through purchase rather than production. But the effect on the household budget is no less immediate. A rise in price constricts choice, narrows portions, and intensifies calculation. The transaction may be urban, but the vulnerability remains fundamental. As London grows, poverty becomes more concentrated and more visible. Not everyone who arrives secures steady employment. Some find temporary work. Others drift from one parish to another, following rumor of opportunity that may or may not materialize. The movement is rarely dramatic. It unfolds through small relocations, brief lodgings, uncertain arrangements. Parish authorities, operating within the framework of the poor laws, attempt to define responsibility carefully. If a newcomer appears likely to require support, officials may remove that person to a parish deemed legally responsible for their maintenance. In this way, settlement becomes more than a matter of residence. It acquires legal weight. Belonging is determined not only by geography, but by documented ties, and movement through the city becomes entangled with the question of who is obligated to sustain whom. Amid this expansion, the early decades of the century witness what later observers describe as the gin craze. Cheap distilled gin becomes widely available, particularly among the urban poor. Consumption rises sharply in certain districts, drawing commentary and criticism. The engravings of William Hogarth, particularly Gin Lane, capture contemporary anxiety about the social consequences of excessive drinking. His imagery is dramatic, even exaggerated, but it reflects genuine concern about disorder, neglect, and instability within crowded neighborhoods. Yet London cannot be reduced to caricature, to images of disorder or excess drawn too sharply against the skyline. Alongside hardship exists ambition that is quieter but persistent. The same streets that hold overcrowded lodging houses also contain doorways through which opportunity passes daily. Coffee houses multiply across the city, their interiors dense with conversation. Within them, men gather not only to drink, but to exchange information, to debate politics, to discuss trade and rumor. These rooms function as informal hubs where news travels by word of mouth before it ever reaches print, and where print, once available, is read aloud and shared. Merchants negotiate contracts in offices and counting houses, their agreements linking London to ports and markets beyond the horizon. Transactions are recorded carefully, letters drafted and dispatched, obligations extended through networks of trust. The city's economic life becomes increasingly articulated through documentation, correspondence, and calculation. Newspapers circulate more rapidly here than in rural regions, carried between districts, posted in coffee houses, sold on corners. News from Parliament, from foreign wars, from colonial trade arrives with a frequency that compresses distance. Literacy rates, particularly among urban populations, show gradual increase, enabling a wider portion of residents to engage directly with printed text, rather than rely solely on oral transmission. Print culture moves alongside material goods, spreading ideas in the same channels through which commodities flow. In this way, London becomes not only a marketplace of objects, but of information, where ambition finds expression in both trade and thought. Law enforcement in this period differs markedly from modern expectations. There is no centralized, professional police force in the early 1700s. Parish watchmen patrol at night, often older men assigned to guard streets in rotation. The Bow Street Runners, established later in the century, begin to introduce more organized pursuit of criminals. But urban order remains a patchwork of local oversight and informal control. Crime exists in varied forms, woven into the density of urban life, rather than standing apart from it. Pickpocketing unfolds in crowded markets where proximity makes distraction easy. Theft occurs along the docks, where goods change hands quickly and oversight can falter. Fraud appears in trade where documentation and trust intersect, and misrepresentation can travel as easily as merchandise. These acts are not rare enough to be shocking, nor constant enough to define the whole city. They form part of the urban texture, recognized and guarded against. At the same time, everyday negotiation of trust operates just as persistently. In commercial districts, reputation carries tangible weight. A name repeated with reliability can open doors that coin alone cannot. Credit arrangements extend across weeks or months. Dependent on perceived steadiness and honesty, goods may be exchanged before payment is complete. Because mutual recognition sustains the system, a merchant's name functions as currency in itself, circulating through conversation and correspondence as a marker of dependability or caution. In this way, trust becomes both economic necessity and social structure. For those migrating from rural areas, London represents both possibility and risk in equal measure. The city promises forms of work not always available in villages. Apprenticeship in a city trade may offer greater specialization, exposure to larger markets, and skills refined within concentrated districts. A domestic servant may enter a household where urban life unfolds at closer range, expanding awareness of habits and expectations beyond rural boundaries. Yet these opportunities carry counterweights. The cost of living is higher, pressing wages against rising rent and food prices. Crowded quarters compress families into tight spaces, where illness spreads more readily. Disease moves through narrow streets with a speed that countryside distance sometimes slows. The same density that generates economic activity also magnifies vulnerability, binding possibility and risk together within the same urban frame. The Thames remains central. Ships arrive bearing goods from across expanding imperial networks. Sugar from Caribbean plantations enters English households in increasing quantity. Tea consumption grows steadily through the century, shifting patterns of domestic life. These commodities alter habits, what is consumed, how meals are structured, yet they rely on maritime labor that is often grueling and unstable. Housing in poorer districts compresses families into subdivided rooms. Staircases are steep. Air circulation is limited. Waste disposal inconsistent. Yet even within such conditions, routine persists. Meals are prepared, garments mended. Apprentices return from workshops. Servants complete tasks long after employers have retired upstairs. If one stands along the river at dusk, the city appears both immense and contained. Masts rise against fading light. Lanterns flicker in windows. The hum does not cease entirely with darkness. London does not sleep as deeply as villages do. Activity lingers. Taverns remain open. Carriages move later into the evening than rural carts ever would. The demographic growth of London throughout the 18th century reflects broader population increases across England. Birth rates remain high. Mortality remains significant, but urban migration offsets losses. The city becomes a magnet, drawing those whose rural circumstances have narrowed. It is important to understand that London's expansion is not yet industrial in the full mechanized sense that later centuries will witness. Workshops remain powered by human and animal strength. Production, though larger in scale, is not yet dominated by factory systems. But concentration itself generates new pressures: crowding, competition, visibility. Within this environment, social boundaries are both reinforced and blurred. Wealth and poverty exist within walking distance. A grand townhouse may stand only streets away from overcrowded lodging houses. Servants move daily between these worlds, inhabiting spaces that are not fully their own. Children in London grow within this density. Apprenticeship remains a central pathway, but exposure to urban diversity broadens perception. Noise replaces open silence. Stone replaces field. The rhythm of tide and trade replaces the rhythm of harvest. Religion persists here as well. Parish churches punctuate neighborhoods. Methodist preaching later in the century draws crowds in urban settings as effectively as in rural fields. Moral reform movements respond to perceived disorder. Charity societies expand. And yet, beneath reform and expansion, the daily logic remains familiar. Labor must be found. Rent must be paid. Food must be purchased. The market opens each morning regardless of ambition or anxiety. London in 1700 is not yet the imperial capital it will become, but it is already a center of accumulation of goods, of bodies, of opportunity and vulnerability intertwined. Its growth does not erase rural England. It intensifies contrast with it. If one listens closely, the city's sound differs fundamentally from that of the countryside. It is layered, persistent, less dependent on weather, more dependent on human proximity. Yet even here, continuity defines survival. Apprentices rise before masters. Servants light fires before employers descend. Dock workers gather before ships arrive. The city swells. The river moves. The market hums. And within this expanding network, ordinary people adapt not as grand actors in imperial drama, but as individuals navigating crowded streets with the same practical attention that farmers once applied to fields. London rises, not in a single moment, but through accumulation, brick upon brick, trade upon trade, life upon life, until the century's pulse beats loudest along the Thames. If work structures the body, belief structures the weak. In 18th century England, religion does not exist at the edge of life. It is woven through it. The parish church stands not merely as a building for prayer, but as an anchor of time and legitimacy. Baptisms, marriages, burials, these are recorded carefully in parish registers, creating a written continuity that often outlasts memory itself. To belong to a parish is not only to reside within geographic boundaries, but to be inscribed within its moral and administrative framework. On Sunday mornings, movement toward the church follows a pattern as steady as the walk to fields on Monday. Clothing is adjusted carefully. Shoes are cleaned when possible. Families enter the nave in relative order, seating arrangements sometimes reflecting social hierarchy. The service unfolds through familiar liturgy, prayers repeated across generations. Scripture is read aloud, for not all present can read independently, and the sermon interprets conduct within a moral framework that touches daily life directly. Attendance is not entirely voluntary in the earlier decades of the century. Parish oversight carries with it an expectation that individuals will be present, visible, and accounted for. To miss a Sunday service is not merely a private decision, but a public absence. It can be remarked upon, quietly at first, then more openly if the pattern continues. The parish exists as both spiritual framework and administrative structure, and participation affirms belonging within both. The church functions not only as a spiritual center, but as a site of observation. Families enter together, sit within sight of neighbors, and move through the liturgy under shared gaze. Conduct becomes part of communal record, even when unwritten. Who attends regularly, who appears distracted, who arrives late, such details are absorbed into collective memory. The architecture itself reinforces visibility. Pews arranged within open nave space allow behavior to be seen as easily as heard. Conformity to communal norms is strengthened not through sudden enforcement, but through repetition. The same prayers spoken weekly, the same rhythms of standing and kneeling, the same sermons delivered from the pulpit gradually shape expectation. Ritual becomes habit, and habit becomes social glue. In this way, belonging is reaffirmed through presence, and absence carries weight precisely because attendance has been made ordinary, regular, and publicly shared. Yet religious life in this period is not static. The early 18th century Church of England maintains formal authority, but by mid-century, movements of renewal begin to stir. Among them is Methodism. Associated with the preaching of John Wesley, Wesley and others preach outdoors as well as in churches, addressing laborers, artisans, and those who feel overlooked by established structures. Their sermons emphasize personal discipline, moral reform, and the possibility of inward transformation. Methodist gatherings introduce a slightly different tone, more emotional, more immediate. Hymns are sung with vigor, testimonies are shared. While some clergy view the movement with suspicion, it spreads across both rural and urban regions, offering spiritual intensity alongside communal belonging. For many ordinary people, it provides language to articulate hardship, not merely as endurance, but as moral trial. Religious belief also intersects with charity and social responsibility. Parish structures administer poor relief under the poor laws, distributing aid to those deemed deserving. Church wardens and overseers manage funds, record payments, and negotiate disputes about settlement. Moral judgment shapes these decisions. Assistance is conditional, often accompanied by scrutiny of character. The churchyard itself reflects both continuity and fragility, standing as a quiet extension of the building beside it. Gravestones, when families can afford them, rise from the ground with names and dates carved into stone, preserving identity in abbreviated form, yet many graves remain unmarked, known only to memory or to the parish register where ink has fixed a life into a single line. Burial practices follow established forms: procession, prayer, earth returned carefully to earth, repeated with consistency across generations. The rhythm of these rites reinforces stability, even as they acknowledge loss. Mortality, particularly among children, appears with sobering regularity in parish records, each entry written in careful script that neither dramatizes nor diminishes the fact of death. The proximity of the church to the burial ground ensures that life and death remain visually and spatially connected. Worshippers enter through a landscape already marked by remembrance, and in doing so, are reminded that continuity and fragility coexist within the same ground. Beyond these formal structures, belief influences conduct in ways that are often subtle, yet pervasive. Oaths sworn before God carry legal and social weight, binding speech to conscience and reinforcing the seriousness of testimony. Marriage vows establish legitimacy recognized by community and law, shaping inheritance, property transfer, and social standing within a clearly defined framework. Sabbath observance introduces a measured pause in routine labor, altering the tempo of the week even if it does not silence every task. Domestic work may continue quietly within the household, yet field work generally halts, signaling collective acknowledgement of sacred time. Through these recurring gestures, sworn words, formal vows, weekly pause belief settles into practice, shaping behavior without requiring constant declaration. Moral life extends into regulation of behavior. Drunkenness, disorderly conduct, and sexual transgression are subject to communal commentary and sometimes formal discipline. Ecclesiastical courts, though declining in power compared to earlier centuries, still address certain moral disputes. Reputation, once again, carries consequence. Education often intertwines closely with religion, not as a secondary element but as its primary framework. Charity schools place strong emphasis on reading scripture, so that literacy, where it develops, is frequently tied first to biblical text rather than to secular material. Letters are learned in order to approach verses. Comprehension is guided through moral instruction. Catechism lessons reinforce doctrinal understanding through repetition, embedding structured questions and answers into memory until they can be recited without hesitation. Instruction is not abstract, but patterned, reinforcing belief alongside basic skills. Even those who cannot read absorb biblical narratives through repeated hearing. Stories are delivered from the pulpit, read aloud within households, referenced in conversation. Over time, these narratives settle into familiarity. Religious language moves beyond church walls and enters ordinary speech, shaping metaphors, expressions of gratitude or warning, and explanations for events that might otherwise seem uncertain. Scripture becomes less a distant text and more a shared vocabulary, present in both formal and informal exchanges. Yet belief in this century is not exclusively institutional or confined to official doctrine. Folk practices persist quietly, woven into daily life without overt challenge to the church. Superstitions about luck endure in small gestures. Weather signs are interpreted through inherited sayings. Charms against illness may be kept discreetly, not in defiance of faith, but alongside it. These habits do not necessarily replace formal teaching. They coexist with it. Official sermons may caution against such practices, urging reliance on orthodox belief, but cultural memory proves resilient. Older habits continue to circulate in subdued forms, carried forward through family transmission and quiet repetition, blending into the broader landscape of belief without fully disappearing. Urban settings introduce additional complexity in London and other towns. Dissenting congregations, Baptists, Quakers, Presbyterians maintain separate meeting houses. Religious pluralism, while limited compared to later periods, becomes more visible. Toleration, though imperfect, allows certain nonconformist groups to worship outside the established church under legal frameworks developed in the late 17th century. Coffee houses and printed pamphlets contribute to theological debate. Sermons are printed and circulated. Religious controversy moves from pulpit to page. Literacy, gradually increasing, allows wider participation in doctrinal discussion. At the household level, belief manifests in routine gestures. A prayer before meals, scripture read aloud in the evening. Children taught commandments not as abstraction, but as behavioral guide. Moral instruction integrates with discipline and expectation. For laboring families, religion offers structure amid uncertainty. Harvest failure may be interpreted through providence. Illness becomes trial. Success, modest though it may be, is framed as blessing rather than solely effort. This interpretive framework does not eliminate hardship, but it organizes response to it. It is important not to romanticize this faith. Fear of judgment exists alongside comfort. Sermons may emphasize sin as strongly as mercy. The concept of eternal consequence shapes conscience. Yet within this moral landscape, community coherence is reinforced. Public rituals mark collective identity. Harvest Thanksgiving services acknowledge agricultural dependence. Royal proclamations may be read from pulpits, linking parish life to national events. War victories, royal deaths, and political shifts are interpreted through religious language. As the century progresses, Enlightenment thought circulates more broadly, particularly among educated elites. Yet for the majority of ordinary people, belief remains practical, embodied, and communal rather than philosophical. If one stands quietly within a parish church at dusk, after the congregation has dispersed, the space retains the echo of voices layered across generations. Wooden pews bear the marks of repeated use. The pulpit stands elevated, symbol of authority and instruction. Light filters through modest glass, casting muted color across stone. Outside, the church bell marks time not only for worship, but for daily rhythm. It calls to service. It signals death. It announces communal awareness. Religion in 18th century England does not operate as separate sphere from economic and social life. It intersects with them continuously. Marriage legitimizes property transfer. Baptism inscribes belonging. Burial confirms mortality within a shared frame. As evening settles and families return home, the measured stillness of the Sabbath gradually loosens its hold, and the week begins again, almost without announcement. The transition is not abrupt. It unfolds through small preparations. Clothing set aside for worship is folded away. Tools are examined in anticipation of morning use. The quiet cadence of Sunday gives way to the practical calculations of Monday. Fields await attention. Workshops open their doors. Markets resume their steady exchange. The cycle resumes not with ceremony, but with expectation. Yet beneath each action, whether the lifting of a plow, the striking of a hammer, or the arranging of goods upon a stall, lies a moral vocabulary learned in pew and hearth alike. Words heard in sermons echo in memory. Phrases repeated in prayer shape interpretation. Lessons taught to children at home reinforce conduct beyond the church walls. The rhythm of belief moves alongside the rhythm of labor, not as interruption but as undercurrent. Belief does not halt labor, nor does it remove the necessity of effort. It does not eliminate fatigue or protect against loss. Instead, it interprets these experiences, placing them within a broader frame of meaning. Hardship becomes trial rather than chaos. Success becomes gratitude rather than accident. Endurance acquires moral dimension rather than mere repetition. And in that interpretation, ordinary people find not certainty of comfort, but coherence, a structure through which effort, loss, and persistence can be understood as part of a larger order. That order may not be fully visible, nor fully explained, but it extends beyond the immediate field, beyond the crowded street, beyond the visible horizon of the century itself. By the final decades of the 18th century, the rhythms that have shaped ordinary life for generations remain intact, yet something subtle begins to shift beneath them. Fields are still plowed by hand and animal strength. Hearth fires are still coaxed to life each morning. Apprentices still bind themselves to masters through written indenture. Parish bells continue to mark time. But the century does not close exactly as it began. Pressure accumulates quietly, not as sudden rupture, but as gradual reorientation. Enclosure continues across parts of rural England, consolidating open fields into privately managed parcels. For some landholders, this promises improved efficiency and profit. For smallholders and landless laborers, it narrows access to common resources. Rights that once allowed grazing or gathering are redefined or withdrawn. Adaptation becomes necessary. Some remain in place, shifting into wage labor more fully than before. Others consider departure. In certain regions, textile production expands beyond domestic spinning and weaving. Workshops increase in size. Production becomes more concentrated. The distinction between home-based labor and externally organized work begins in limited areas to blur. These changes are uneven, not universal. Many villages continue as they always have. Yet, in pockets of England, scale alters expectation. Technological innovation, still modest in its immediate reach, begins to alter possibility. Improvements in steam power associated with figures such as James Watt expand potential for mechanized energy beyond traditional water and wind. At this stage, the steam engine is not yet reshaping every landscape, but its presence signals that labor may eventually be reorganized around new sources of force. Road networks improve, gradually facilitating movement of goods and people. Turnpike trusts manage certain stretches, collecting tolls to maintain routes. Travel, though still demanding, becomes more predictable along major corridors. News commodities and migrants circulate with increasing regularity. London continues to grow its appetite for labor and goods deepening. Provincial towns too expand in selective regions. Migration patterns intensify toward urban centers, offering opportunity, or at least survival. Rural households that once assumed generational continuity on the same soil begin to confront the possibility of departure as ordinary option rather than rare exception. Yet for the majority of ordinary people, daily life does not feel revolutionary. It feels incremental. The field still demands attention. The loom still requires hands. Bread must still be purchased or baked. The experience of change is mediated through small adjustments rather than dramatic awareness. One might imagine a laborer in 1790 standing at the edge of a field, much as his grandfather did decades earlier. The tools may differ slightly. The boundaries may be hedged differently. Wages may be more common than shared harvest rights. But the posture of work remains familiar. Similarly, a domestic servant in an expanding town may notice increased variety of goods in employer households, tea more frequent sugar, less rare printed materials more abundant, yet her tasks remain structured by cleaning, cooking, maintenance. Change enters gradually through objects before it transforms systems. Education shows modest extension rather than sudden expansion. The structures already in place, charity schools, parish instruction, apprenticeship training, continue to function, and in some areas they reach slightly further than before. Literacy maintains its gradual upward movement, particularly within urban environments, where access to printed material and opportunities for instruction are somewhat more concentrated. The increase is uneven and measured, but noticeable over time. The ability to read, once confined to narrower circles, begins to appear more frequently among artisan shopkeepers and segments of the laboring population. Printed material becomes more accessible in both form and circulation. Newspapers, pamphlets, broadsides, and inexpensive booklets pass through hands in markets and coffee houses, moving beyond the elite readership of earlier generations. Text is no longer confined to private libraries. It becomes part of public exchange. Political debate surrounding events in America and France toward the century's end travels through these channels carried in reports, commentary, and argument. News of revolution and reform crosses the Channel and the Atlantic through ink and paper. Yet for many laboring families, such discourse remains distant from immediate necessity. The existence of debate does not displace the urgency of securing bread-paying rent or fulfilling apprenticeship terms. Political language may be heard or read, but daily survival retains priority. The presence of ideas does not automatically translate into participation. For those whose time is claimed by labor engagement with distant events, often remains secondary to the rhythms of work and household maintenance. The poor laws continue to operate, though strain increases as populations grow and economic transitions complicate employment stability. Parish relief systems adjust, but not always sufficiently. Settlement laws still determine responsibility. Movement continues to be shaped by both opportunity and legal boundary. It is tempting from later vantage points to see the late 18th century primarily as prelude to industrial transformation, to mechanized production, to urban expansion on unprecedented scale. Yet from within the century itself, awareness of impending revolution is muted. Ordinary people experience pressure rather than prophecy. Continuity remains powerful. Marriage, birth, apprenticeship, illness, death. These cycles persist, unchanged in structure, even as economic foundations shift subtly. Belief continues to interpret labor. Parish registers continue to record entries in steady script. If one listens closely in a workshop experimenting with larger-scale production, the sound may differ slightly more, concentrated, more rhythmic. If one observes a hedged field, newly enclosed, the visual boundary may appear sharper than the open strips of previous decades. If one walks through London streets, density may feel thicker, commerce faster. But there is no singular moment when the century pauses and declares itself transformed. No bell tolls to announce the arrival of a new order. No boundary is crossed with full awareness. The shift does not gather in one visible point. It disperses across countless ordinary decisions and quiet adjustments. Instead, change accumulates. It gathers in the choice of a son who leaves his village, not with the expectation of return after harvest, but with the understanding that he may build his life elsewhere. It gathers in the movement of a daughter who enters service in a town that grows incrementally each year. Her departure altering the balance of one household while contributing to the expansion of another. It gathers in the recalibration of a family once reliant on common land, now adjusting steadily to wage labor as a more central means of survival. It gathers in the calculation of a merchant who commits capital to expanded production, not as a symbolic act, but as a practical step toward increased output. It gathers in the improvement of a road that once mired in mud becomes more reliably passable, allowing goods and people to move with slightly greater consistency. It gathers in the circulation of a printed pamphlet that travels further than anticipated, carrying ideas across distances that once limited their reach. None of these developments taken alone defines a revolution. Each appears modest, even ordinary, yet together they alter trajectory. Their cumulative weight redirects patterns of settlement, labor exchange, and thought. The century does not overturn itself in a single gesture. It shifts through repetition, through motion that seems incremental, until in retrospect it reveals a different alignment entirely. The resilience that has defined ordinary life throughout the century remains essential. Adaptation has always been required through harvest failure, illness, fluctuating price. Now adaptation extends into new forms of organization and movement. By 1800, England stands at the threshold of developments that later generations will confidently describe as industrial, though those who inhabit the moment do not yet possess that vocabulary. The transformation is not announced with clarity. It is sensed more as pressure than as revelation. Yet the people who cross into that new century do so carrying with them habits shaped over decades beside hearth and hedgerow. The discipline of apprenticeship remains ingrained, in understanding that skill is learned through repetition and patience. The moral vocabulary formed in parish pews continues to frame effort and obligation. The endurance cultivated through fluctuating harvests, illness, and uncertain wages does not vanish simply because tools or roads begin to change. The edge of change is rarely visible from within. It does not present itself as a sharp dividing line between eras. It feels instead like gradual adjustment, slight reorientation of work, subtle redirection of movement, incremental expansion of possibility. Daily life still resembles what it was, even as its foundations begin to shift beneath the surface. As evening settles once more across countryside and city alike, fires are lit as they have always been coaxed from embers into steady flame. Children sleep beneath blankets layered against cold, their breathing rising and falling in rooms that hold both familiarity and quiet uncertainty. Bells toll from parish towers, marking hours in tones unchanged by innovation. Yet beneath this familiar rhythm, foundations shift slowly. Boundaries are redrawn. Labor reorganizes in subtle ways. Movement stretches beyond former limits. None of it feels abrupt. All of it accumulates, and ordinary people without proclamation or ceremony move forward into a century that will ask of them new forms of labor, new forms of migration, new forms of endurance. Yet even as those demands evolve, they will still depend upon the same quiet resilience that sustained the one before it, the capacity to adapt without spectacle, to continue without fanfare. The wheel turns, as it always has. The field waits, though its edges may look different. The road extends further than it once did, carrying footsteps beyond accustomed horizons. And England, at the close of the 18th century, stands neither entirely unchanged nor wholly transformed. It rests briefly in a state of balance between inheritance and emergence, between continuity and alteration, poised on the threshold of what will later be named but not yet fully understood. If labor gives structure to the week, and belief gives it meaning, leisure gives it texture. In 18th century England, ordinary life is not composed solely of work, worship, illness, and endurance. There are intervals brief, seasonal, communal, when routine loosens its hold and space opens for gathering. These moments do not overturn the hierarchy of necessity, but they soften it. They allow laughter to sit beside obligation without contradiction. Seasonal rhythms provide the most visible occasions for collective release. Harvest once completed is not merely an agricultural milestone, but a social one. After the final sheaves are gathered and secured, there is often acknowledgement, not always elaborate, but present. Food may be shared more generously than usual. Conversation lingers. Fatigue remains, but it is accompanied by recognition that effort has reached temporary completion. Village fairs punctuate the calendar in certain regions. They bring stalls, small entertainments exchanges that combine commerce with festivity. Goods are sold, but so are stories. Neighbors from surrounding parishes arrive, expanding the circle of familiarity. The fair is not constant, it is anticipated. Its arrival alters the tempo of the day, even if only briefly. May Day celebrations persist in some areas, though their form varies. A maypole raised in the village green, dancing arranged in circular motion ribbons, woven and unwoven through repeated steps. The choreography is simple but communal. Participation matters more than precision. These rituals do not carry the weight of doctrine. They carry continuity of custom. In towns and cities, leisure takes different shapes. Taverns and alehouses provide space for conversation after work. These interiors are not solely sites of excess. They are places where information circulates, where laborers discuss wages, where artisans exchange news. Wood tables bear the marks of repeated use. Candles flicker against low ceilings. The noise level rises and falls with the hour. Music threads through many of these settings. Fiddles, simple pipes, voices joined in song. Ballads recount events, tragedies, humor. Lyrics travel orally before they are printed. Songs are remembered not because they are archived, but because they are sung again. Domestic leisure also exists in quieter forms. Evenings beside the hearth allow for storytelling. Tales passed through generations, some moral, some humorous, some cautionary shape imagination. Children listen. Adults repeat familiar lines. The absence of mechanical entertainment does not imply absence of diversion. It implies a different mode of it. Games appear in modest form, woven lightly into the edges of daily life, rather than standing apart from it. A deck of cards spread across a worn wooden table. Dice cast with quiet anticipation. Informal competitions of strength or wit unfolding in open space, drawing small circles of onlookers. These moments are not constant, nor are they universal across every household or parish, but they recur often enough to become familiar. Recreation does not displace labor or construct a separate sphere of existence. It integrates into the same rooms, the same greens, the same taverns, where work and conversation already occur. It occupies the margins of routine without overturning it. Courtship unfolds naturally within these shared spaces. A glance exchanged at a fair carries possibility without declaration. A conversation extended at a tavern door lingers just beyond necessity. A dance shared beneath open sky allows proximity within accepted boundaries. These gestures are small and public-shaped by communal presence rather than privacy. Marriage remains structured by economic and familial considerations, property reputation, stability, but within those frameworks, affection finds room to develop. Familiarity grows through repeated gatherings, through shared participation in custom and celebration. Clothing during festive moments reflects this subtle shift in tone. Garments are not transformed dramatically, but adjusted, A ribbon is added with care. A piece of fabric preserved for better occasions is brought out from storage and worn deliberately. The difference between weekday and festival attire is measured rather than extravagant, yet it signals intention. The contrast is slight but meaningful, marking the day as distinct without separating it entirely from the life that surrounds it. Leisure, however, is never entirely detached from labor. A fair day may still require preparation. Harvest celebration follows exhaustion. Tavern conversation may turn quickly toward employment prospects. The boundary between recreation and responsibility remains permeable. Urban leisure develops additional layers as the century progresses. Pleasure gardens in London, such as Vauxhall, offer music and illumination to those who can afford entry. Yet these spaces remain inaccessible to many laborers. Class distinction shapes access to entertainment as clearly as it shapes housing. Religious sensibilities influence leisure as well. Sabbatarian expectations limit certain activities on Sundays. Moral reform movements toward the century's end express concern about excessive indulgence. Tension arises between enjoyment and restraint. Weather plays its part. Winter narrows outdoor gathering, drawing activity indoors. Summer extends daylight lengthening opportunity for communal presence. Seasonal variation shapes mood as much as schedule. Children experience leisure differently than adults. Games played in lanes or fields improvised from available materials. Freedom exists, though bounded by expectation of return to duty when called. It would be inaccurate to imagine constant festivity. Leisure occupies margins rather than center, but those margins matter. They provide contrast that defines labor more clearly. If one stands at the edge of a village green during a fair, the scene does not suggest revolution or upheaval. There is no sense of rupture, no dramatic departure from the familiar order of things. Instead, it resembles continuity infused with variation, a pattern long established yet slightly brightened by the occasion. Faces that have been seen daily in fields or along lanes appear in a different arrangement, mingling with those from neighboring parishes. Familiar greetings are exchanged beside unfamiliar accents. Laughter rises, carries briefly across open space, then settles again into the broader hum of activity. Transactions unfold alongside conversation. Coins change hands even as stories circulate. The practical and the festive occupy the same ground without contradiction. Similarly, in an urban tavern, the noise that gathers beneath low ceilings does not amount to disorder alone. It is layered exchange. Voices overlap not merely in excess, but in communication. Stories are told and retold, carrying news or humor from one table to another. Grievances are aired openly, sometimes cautiously, sometimes with animation. Plans are discussed in half-finished sentences and quiet agreements. The atmosphere is animated, but it remains structured by shared understanding of space and role. Leisure allows community to reassert itself beyond hierarchy, if only briefly. A farmer and a laborer may share a dance without formal acknowledgement of difference. An apprentice may sing beside a master, their voices indistinguishable in melody. The established boundaries of class and authority do not dissolve entirely. They remain visible and real. Yet for a moment, their edges soften. Participation takes precedence over rank. Presence outweighs position. And in that temporary easing, the structure of society remains intact, but less rigid than it might otherwise seem. These moments also serve memory. A particular harvest feast recalled years later. A song associated with a certain season. a fair remembered for unexpected encounter. Memory binds identity as surely as labor does. As the century moves toward its close, some customs begin to alter under economic and social pressure. Enclosure reduces common gathering space in certain regions. Urbanization changes the scale of public events. Yet, custom adapts. It rarely vanishes entirely. The texture of ordinary joy lies not in extravagance, but in repetition. A familiar tune sung again, a dance step learned in childhood, repeated in adulthood. A gathering that resembles last year's, yet feels newly shared. When evening settles after a day of festivity, the return to routine does not arrive as a sharp interruption, but as a gradual recentering. The sounds of gathering thin out slowly. Footsteps disperse along familiar paths. Fires are lit once more not as symbols of celebration, but as anchors of the everyday. Tools are lifted, examined, and set in place for tomorrow's use, their presence steady and reassuring. Children fall asleep with the rhythm of earlier music still faintly echoing in memory, the day's brightness softening into rest. Leisure does not erase hardship, nor does it dissolve the realities of poverty, illness, or labor. The structural demands of survival remain intact. Fields still require tending. Wages still determine security. Bodies still tire. Yet leisure complicates any narrative that would define the century solely through endurance. It introduces dimension. It reveals that within constraint there is also expression. Ordinary joy exists not as spectacle, but as recurrence. It exists in shared bread after harvest, where the simple act of eating together carries acknowledgement of collective effort. It exists in laughter carried across a green rising briefly and settling again. It exists in conversation extended beyond immediate necessity, where words are exchanged not for transaction, but for presence. It exists in the small indulgence of song, a melody repeated not because it is required, but because it is remembered. In these modest forms, joy takes shape, not grand, not transformative, but real. And as night deepens and the last sounds of conversation fade into the dark quiet, returns gradually rather than all at once. The village exhales. The city lowers its volume. Doors close. Candles burn shorter. What had expanded outward through laughter and music folds gently back into interior space. Both village and city settle again into their familiar cadence, not unchanged, because memory now accompanies them, but refreshed in subtle ways that do not require declaration. The week resumes, as it always does, without ceremony. Morning arrives with its expectations intact. The field waits again, its surface indifferent to yesterday's celebration. The workshop door opens on its hinges as it has done countless times before, admitting light onto tools arranged in patient order. The market reclaims its hum. The hearth reclaims its central place. Yet something lingers beneath the repetition. Within the steady return to labor remains the memory of gathering of voices, joined of faces encountered beyond routine exchange of presence, shared without the urgency of production. That brief expansion beyond duty does not disappear simply because work resumes. It settles quietly into recollection, softening effort without removing it. That memory too sustains the century. It does not replace necessity, but it accompanies it. It reminds those who labor that they belong not only to tasks, but to one another. And so, the texture of 18th century life is not woven from labor alone. It is formed equally from the intervals between it, those measured pauses, when the ordinary seems to glow, when repetition briefly opens into something wider, and when for a moment endurance feels shared rather than solitary. When we step back from the century and allow its details to settle, what remains is not a single event, nor a singular reform, nor even the outline of industrial change that later historians will emphasize. What remains is rhythm. The 18th century in England does not move as a sequence of isolated turning points for ordinary people. It moves as repetition layered over repetition, morning into evening, season into season, birth into apprenticeship, illness into recovery or burial, work into brief intervals of gathering, belief into interpretation, migration into adjustment, and then again, if one returns, in imagination, to a small cottage at dusk, the structure appears simple. A hearth radiates warmth unevenly across a room whose walls bear the marks of years. A table holds tools, bread, perhaps a cup set aside. The day's labor has concluded not with ceremony, but with quiet placement of objects back into their expected positions. Outside, fields lie dark. In a distant town, a workshop door has closed. In London, along the Thames, the final cargo of the day has been secured. Yet within these spaces, what persists is not hardship alone. It is not merely scarcity or endurance. It is the habit of continuation. Ordinary people in 18th century England live within limits, economic, physical, social, but they do not live without structure. That structure is built from participation. Children are folded gradually into responsibility. Apprentices learn through proximity and repetition. Women's labor sustains the household without fanfare. Men's labor marks fields and workshops with visible effort. Parish bells measure time. Markets regulate exchange. Fairs and taverns create moments of shared relief. None of these elements stands in isolation. They do not exist as separate strands drifting apart from one another. They interlock, overlapping in ways that are often subtle but deeply structural. Labor shapes household rhythm. Belief interprets labor. Community reinforces endurance. Endurance strengthens community. Economic pressure alters movement. Movement reshapes community again. Each thread crosses another, forming a pattern that holds because of connection rather than separation. When harvest fails, belief offers language through which loss can be understood, framing scarcity within a moral vocabulary already familiar. When illness strikes, community adjusts its balance, redistributing effort where it can, even if only temporarily. When enclosure narrows access to common resources, migration becomes not merely possibility, but practical response. When literacy rises slightly, ideas circulate further, extending influence beyond immediate geography. When cities expand, villages respond through departure, through adaptation, through recalibration of expectation. The century is not defined by static uniformity, because variation and pressure are always present, nor is it defined by constant rupture, because continuity remains powerful. Instead, it is defined by adaptation that rarely announces itself as transformation. Adjustment occurs quietly, absorbed into routine. Change settles into habit before it is named. And through this understated process, the shape of life shifts without ever fully abandoning its familiar structure. Even as roads improve and production concentrates in certain regions, the habits formed beside hearth and hedgerow do not disappear. They travel with those who migrate. The discipline learned in apprenticeship does not evaporate when machines begin to hum more loudly. The moral vocabulary formed in parish pews does not vanish when political pamphlets circulate more widely. If we listen closely to the closing decades of the century, the sound is layered rather than singular. The creak of a cart on a better maintained road, the murmur of conversation in a coffee house, the steady rhythm of a loom in a larger workshop, the tolling of a church bell unchanged by innovation. These sounds overlap rather than replace one another, and for the majority of people, life continues to revolve around immediacy, securing bread, maintaining shelter, raising children, negotiating price, preserving reputation. Grand narratives of empire or revolution filter downward slowly, refracted through the lens of necessity. If one stands at the edge of a churchyard as evening light fades, gravestones cast long shadows across uneven ground. Names carved decades earlier rest beside those newly inscribed. Generations overlap. The living step carefully between markers, without pausing to interpret history as transformation. For them, the continuity of presence matters more than the classification of era. By 1800, England will enter a century that accelerates change more visibly. Industry will expand. Urbanization will intensify. Political reform will widen debate. Yet those who step into that new century do so carrying the habits of the old one. They carry the expectation that work begins early and ends late. They carry the understanding that illness is possible but survivable. They carry the practice of gathering when harvest concludes. They carry the memory of songs sung at fairs. They carry the discipline of signing indentures and honoring contracts. They carry the awareness that belonging is tied to parish and place, even when place must be left behind. What remains, then, is not nostalgia. It is texture, the texture of hands roughened by fieldwork, of linen woven from thread spun in firelight, of ink drying in parish registers, of stone worn smooth by generations leaning against it. It is also the texture of modest joy, of shared bread, of laughter beneath open sky, of a ribbon added carefully to mark a different kind of day. The 18th century for ordinary people does not announce itself through spectacle. It reveals itself through accumulation of tasks, of memory, of endurance. If we allow the scene to quiet completely, if we let the movement of voices and tools and footsteps fall away, we return to the same image with which we began, a fire dimming slowly to embers, its glow reduced but not extinguished, a household settling into rest, bodies arranged within familiar space, the faint sound of distant wind moving across open fields or threading its way between city buildings. Nothing dramatic marks the end of the day. The stillness feels earned, not imposed. Tomorrow will resemble today in its outline. The same routines will call, the same spaces will be occupied, the same gestures will be repeated, and yet not entirely the same. The resemblance holds, but it does not freeze time. A road may be slightly improved, its surface more reliable beneath passing wheels. A pamphlet may circulate further than before, carried through more hands. A son may depart with less certainty of return. A daughter may remain in town rather than resume life in her childhood parish. A workshop may expand its output modestly. A field may be hedged where once it lay open. These adjustments do not overturn the structure beneath them. They do not dismantle the framework of work, belief, community, and repetition that defines daily life. Instead, they rest upon it. They accumulate quietly, layering change onto continuity. The foundation remains visible even as its edges shift. And so, when we ask how ordinary people lived in the 18th century England, the answer is not singular. They lived within repetition. They lived within constraint. They lived within community. They lived within belief. They lived within adaptation. They endured. Yes, but endurance alone does not define them. They also gathered when work allowed it, drawing close in fields after harvest, or beneath low tavern ceilings. They sang songs whose verses traveled by memory rather than manuscript. They negotiated prices, wages, and marriages with careful attention. They learned skills through repetition and correction, passing them quietly from one generation to the next. They remembered names, seasons, losses, small celebrations holding continuity not in archives alone but in habit and story. As night falls fully and the last bell of the day fades into silence, what lingers is not the sense of a dramatic transformation unfolding before watchful eyes. There is no visible threshold crossed in that final hour. Instead, what remains is a steady presence, the persistence of lives arranged around rhythm rather than rupture, the quiet interior of a cottage, the dim outline of a field beyond its walls, the knowledge that tomorrow will ask for similar effort. The wheel has turned countless times, its motion so familiar that it scarcely requires notice. The field has been plowed and replowed, season layered upon season without proclamation. The market has opened and closed in cycles that mark continuity more than change. The parish register has filled line by line, each entry modest, each name set into sequence with those before and after, and in that steady unfolding lies the truest portrait of the century. It is not merely a prelude to what follows, not simply the foundation for later transformation. It stands as a complete world in itself, ordered by repetition, shaped by adaptation, sustained by ordinary lives lived with quiet persistence, where meaning is found not in spectacle, but in continuation. And now, as we slowly leave behind the fields, the market squares, the narrow London streets, and the quiet interiors of 18th century cottages, notice what remains with you. It may not be a specific law or a famous reform, not the name of a monarch or the outcome of a distant war, but rather a feeling steady, grounded, human. The people we encountered tonight did not see themselves as living in a dramatic chapter of history. They did not speak of revolutions or transformations in the language we use now. They woke before sunrise, tended fields or looms, carried water, measured flour carefully against uncertain wages, and ended their days beside a hearth that offered warmth, but not certainty. The changes that would eventually reshape England, the rise of factories, the surge of population, the movement from countryside to city arrived gradually, almost quietly at first, felt not as headlines but as subtle shifts in routine. A field enclosed, a child apprenticed, a new road cut through familiar land. And yet, through all of this, ordinary people adapted not because they sought change, but because survival required it. If you're feeling drowsy now, let that be enough. There's nothing you need to remember perfectly, nothing you need to analyze. Let the images soften and drift. But before you close your eyes completely, I'd love to know which part of tonight's journey felt most vivid to you. Was it the rural village, the crowded London streets, the quiet church on a Sunday morning? Leave a comment and tell me, and if you find comfort in these slow walks through history, consider subscribing so we can travel again soon. Wherever you are tonight, I hope your rest is deep and peaceful,